In this tutorial, I'll be utilizing RigIT and Blender to show you how to automatically rig and thereby essentially automatically animate uh, meshes from a mesh library with animations from an animation library. Here we'll be utilizing the Connect skeleton for our animation library, and we will be utilizing meshes taken from the popular video game Skyrim and the Skyrim mesh library. So for all of you Skyrim modders out there, pay close attention and I will show you how to create custom animations for your Skyrim mods. So to start out with, we're just going to create a new blank scene. So we'll go over here to the upper left, click on File, New, Reload Startup File. We don't need the square, so we're just going to type delete, then say click on delete, and then go back to File, Import, and then away from an object. And we'll import a pre-assembled mesh. Now, for those of you who are not familiar with Skyrim or video games like Skyrim, they utilize a collection of smaller meshes to make their final graphics. So here we see we've got the head, the hand, the body frame, the undergarments, and the feet. In fact, I know from working with this graphic earlier that we actually have two body armor or body graphics. So I'm just going to delete the one that says underwear body armor because we don't need that one. It just gets repetitive. Now we have all these broken up submeshes because when you're animating, especially a highly customizable video game like Skyrim, utilizing the smaller meshes allows you to add the degree of customizability you see in Skyrim while still keeping your computational load low. So basically, if you don't, you end up having you end up having to render a lot of things that you don't see in the final image. So we've got this pre-assembled mesh. Let's go ahead and try to rig the Connect skeleton to it. So we're going to go ahead and import our Connect skeleton. And if we start trying to center it in our mesh, what we start to see is that it doesn't really fit very well. And it's not just an issue of scale or positioning, it really just doesn't fit our mesh. So what we could do is we could spend all the time required to manually reposition and reconfigure the skeleton from our animation library for our current mesh. Or what we can do is we can use RigIT to do it for us. Now, I'm not going to need the skeleton anymore, so I'm going to go ahead and delete it over here. So in our scene tree, right-click on the skeleton, and then delete. And one note, for any automatic rigger out there, if you have huge objects such as, for example, a satchel or a fanny pack hanging off her side, that's not going to be a good thing, because what will happen is it'll end up pulling your joints towards that object that's hanging off the side of your mesh. So you want to use a mesh that's going to be kind of minimal, so it's kind of like the naked human being like we have here, for your graphics library, and then use that rig repeatedly in your graphics library for the different initial poses that you have. Now, that only works, of course, if your library is fairly uniform like Skyrim's is. If you have fairly non-uniform meshes in your library, you are probably going to have to do a lot more rigging and a lot more work than I might make it look like. But if you can at all start with a minimal mesh, you want to go ahead and do that, and it doesn't matter what automatic rigger you have, they're all going to kind of behave the same way. And one final note, for RigIT, RigIT really doesn't like to import a lot of small objects in one file. It really only wants one big object at a time. So what we're going to do is we're going to join all of these submeshes into one big large mesh object. We do that by holding on the shift and then right-clicking on each of our submeshes until we have everything selected, which you can look over here in our scene tree, and if there's a little orange haze around all of these little mesh icons, then you know they're all selected. So then we can go over to the left and click on join. Now we have one big object, and we're just going to export that out to our desktop. Actually, we'll export it back to the file we pulled everything from. There we go. So and we'll call it mesh, because mesh works. When you export, don't export the modifiers. Do export the normals. UVs are okay, doesn't matter either way. Don't export the materials, you're just not going to use them. So then just click on export, and then you're done. Now later on we're actually going to want all of the submeshes when we're working with reskinning our mesh inside Blender. So we're going to just type Control Z, so while holding down Control, type Z, and that gives us all of our initial submeshes back. So now with a single mesh exported out, we can go ahead and open up RigIT. So I'm going to go down and I am going to open up RigIT for us. And now we can import our exported mesh into our scene. Oh, sorry, that's in my other window. Here we go. So we've got the mesh object down here, and here we see our pre-assembled female form. Now we can go ahead and open our skeleton. It's going to be back on desktop. And here you see we've got the Connect skeleton loaded along with our mesh. Now it's been pre-scaled. RigIT will do that for you, and pre-centered in our mesh. Now RigIT is a near pose rigger, so if you notice, it doesn't have to be exactly where you want it. But of course, if it was, then you wouldn't need RigIT. Another note, it is a near pose rigger, but you also want to watch out for things where the joints are getting really bunched up, because that can cause you to, it can cause one or more joints to starve a remaining joint, and that remaining joint kind of basically gets dropped out of the skeleton. So you want the joints far enough apart that they don't starve each other. But with all that said, we can just go ahead and click on RigIT, and it rigs our skeleton for us, so that makes our life nice and easy. Now, it is a near pose rigger, so you do have to have the skeleton reasonably near to the pose of the mesh, but it obviously doesn't have to be identical. Now, one final note, it looks good as it is, and if you like it, use it. But I wanted to be able to show you guys how to edit the pose if you don't like something. Remember when we were talking about satchels, where if you have a satchel, it might, for example, hanging off the hip, it might pull this hip joint towards the satchel? Well, we've got a female form, and she's got a couple big satchels in the front, and what that's doing is pulling this shoulder joint towards her satchels. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just go ahead, and I like the shoulders more in the shoulder than RigIT gave me, so I'm just going to go ahead and move them there. So you just click in the shoulder region. Yep, that was a little higher than I wanted, sorry. And RigIT will automatically move the joint for you. So you can change the orientation by the left and right arrows, or change the view actually, rotate the mesh. And if you look here, we can see the shoulder joints now more in the shoulder. So the way that works is whatever joint is closest to where you're clicking inside the mesh will be centered where you are clicking on the mesh. You don't have to worry about the problems with working in 3D, where it's where you want it from your perspective, but it could be way back in the, say, Z direction because you're looking down Z. Well, you don't have to worry about that in RigIT. Also, you don't have to worry if you click way out here in the scene somewhere. You have to be close enough to a joint before it'll actually update the joint. So, all that said, we're looking good, so we're just going to go ahead and save our rig skeleton, and we'll just call it Skell. And then we'll go back to Blender, and we'll import our skeleton. So, wavefront. Wait, sorry. I want the skeleton, not a mesh. My bad. So, okay, go up here to File, Import, Motion Capture, BVH, import Skell. Now, the reason why Blender is putting the skeleton so low in the scene is because the parent or root of the skeleton Actually, it's the parent node for the entire skeleton, or root node for the skeleton, is at the pelvis, at least for the skeleton we're using. And the root node always is at the origin of the scene. So that's just kind of how it is for Blender. So we're going to want to have to move that skeleton into position, and you just type G, and then if you look, the Z-axis is up and down, so you're going to type Z, and that allows you to position your skeleton, or move your skeleton up just along the Z-axis, and that looks good enough for now. Now, one thing that I almost always forget to do is make it easy for us to see the skeleton. So if you look over here on the right, with the skeleton selected, clicked on or highlighted or selected, you look over here on the right and you find the armature button. It's the one that's got the little icon that's looks like a person in the Da Vinci pose. Click on that, and then in all of these control regions you find display and then X-ray. Click on X-ray, or the box next to X-ray, and that allows you to see the skeleton through the mesh. Let's go ahead and just center our skeleton a little bit better vertically. And now I'm going to rotate our mesh, and I'm going to center it forward and back. Looks pretty good. Do that a little bit better. Oops, not why. Alright. We're looking pretty good here. So, now with our skeleton centered, and if you look at it, it's in the correct pose for our mesh. So with it all centered and looking great, like I said earlier, this is a pretty basic mesh, and we want an interesting mesh, not a basic plain Jane one. So we're going to go up here to left, File, and we're going to import a new pre-assembled mesh, which has got armor. Now this isn't the armor that you saw a minute ago, it's a different set of armor. Now if we go over here on the left, what we can see, if you look at it, it's really pretty busy right now. I'm going to go ahead and turn X-ray off just to simplify the scene. But the scene's still really pretty busy, or our mesh is, it looks like it's got a lot of stuff that it's kind of repetitive, and that would be correct. It does. So what we're going to do, we don't need the hands anymore, for example, because we have gauntlets on now. So we're just going to right click on those and then select delete. We also don't need the feet anymore, so we're going to delete those. We don't need the regular underwear. So if you see, here's her brassiere. It's actually sticking through I think this is a armor breastplate, and obviously you don't need, that shouldn't be happening. So then we've got, let's see here, we've got 3 different body defaults, and we don't need any of them. So what we're going to do is find the ones we don't like. Now, I don't like this one because it's really bright white. That means something to Skyrim, but it doesn't mean anything to us, so we're going to go ahead and delete that. And then we've got these 2 remaining. This one's a little bit darker than the rest of our meshes, so I'm going to just get rid of it. Now, you might be wondering, well, why are all of those duplicate meshes, or mesh components there? Well, remember, like I said, this is a collection of different mesh objects. And, for example, the gauntlets had their own body armor, or what they call over here female underwear body armor. The gauntlets had their own mesh for that. The boots had their own mesh for that. The cuirass has their own mesh for that. Our previous plain Jane model had its own mesh for that. So that's where they all came from, and we just got rid of them all because we don't need them all anymore. We only need one. And now we're looking pretty good from a graphical standpoint. So now we want to animate what we have. So we already got our skeleton in a good pose. We're going to go ahead and turn X-ray back on so we can see. Looks pretty good. And again, that's because we know our library is going to be pretty uniform. If it's not, like for example, you have some monster somewhere that has an extra long arm, or maybe it has a tail sticking out the back, or big floppy ears that you want to animate, Those may require you to use totally different skeletons altogether. An extra long arm might require you just to play with the arm a bit, but you know that's computer graphics. So we're looking pretty good though. So the next thing that we're going to do is we're going to want to actually skin the mesh to this rig skeleton. First thing we've got to do is we've got to tell Blender that we can actually rig the mesh. So you select everything, all of the different subcomponents. I always forget the satchel here. Look over here on the left to make sure everything that is a mesh object is highlighted. Then come down over here to the lower left. Sorry. Look over here on the right to make sure everything that's a mesh object is highlighted. Then over here to the lower left, find the object button, click on it. Then go to Apply, Rotation and Scale. Just click on that. That's a Blender thing. Blender requires you to do that for mesh objects. And now what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to also, with everything else selected, select the skeleton, which can be a little bit tricky because it's inside the mesh, but we just got it. Now what we want to do now is we want to set all of the mesh objects as children of the skeleton. The way that works is the last object you clicked on, or the one that's highlighted in the brighter yellow outline instead of the deeper orange outline, that's the last object you clicked on. That object, when you say set parent, everything becomes its parent. If you don't have the skeleton as the last one you click on, you're not going to set the mesh as the child of the parent. You're going to set the skeleton as the child of one of your meshes. And you don't want to do that. You want to have everything the child of the skeleton. And that's how you're actually able to skin the mesh. So make sure everything's selected and that the skeleton is got the little yellowish orange outline around it. And then hold down Control and type P. And then we get the set parent little window pop up, and we want armature deform. And a lot of times people like to do with automatic weights, and I really actually love automatic weights. It's great. But for this particular mesh, it just does a lousy, just horrifically lousy job, which is also kind of one of the reasons I chose the mesh. I wanted to kind of let y'all see, you know, how to do everything. So you really can't, I would not recommend using automatic weights, because if you use automatic weights, what'll happen is, say, this bone here in the hand will have stuff from way over here on the wrong side of the body, and it's just a nightmare. So Control P. What we're going to do, envelope weights work okay. What we're going to do is we're just going to say empty groups. Now, when you do that, if you go down to Object Mode, Pose, and then click on one of our bones and try to move it somewhere, you notice nothing goes with it. That's because there's an empty group associated with that bone. We don't want it way over here, so we're going to do Control Z. We're now back to where we started. And what we want to do is we now want to assign the weights to our mesh. Now, this can be a pretty messy process if you have to do it manually. So what we're going to do is we're going to make everything that we're not working with invisible. Now we want to start working with this, our character's left hand. So what we're going to do is we're going to go over to our scene tree, and we're going to make the boots invisible by clicking on the little eye icon, both cursor components, the head, the hair, the body, the underwear part, the paladin, and the satchel. So all we have left is our gauntlets. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to zoom in on our gauntlets. And what we want to do is we want to only associate the hand with our hand bone. So we're going to, in our object tree, or scene object tree, click on the gauntlets, and then come down over here to our mode selection and go to weight paint. And we're just going to highlight our hand. So make sure that the bone is got the little blue line outline, so you're actually showing the edges for the bone, and they're blue, this kind of bright blue. And just go ahead and paint the hand. So it's kind of tedious, but sometimes you're just stuck with tedious. So now we're gonna just get the whole hand painted. And every now and then you'll do something like that and paint the wrong gauntlet. If you look over here, I'll show you how to fix that in a minute. Although that was kind of intentional on my part, but I'll show you how to fix that. Let's go ahead and get this finished up first though. Okay, so we've got all of the hand painted. We've got some of this upper shield, but for our purposes, I'm not really going to worry about that a whole lot. Just to make sure the whole hand is. And now, if you accidentally paint the wrong object, you go over here on the left where it says Mix, Subtract, and then Highlight. So if you haven't figured out yet, deep blue means that there's no bone weights assigned to that part of the mesh for the currently selected bone. So when we first went to weight paint, you noticed everything was deep blue. Deep red means that you have a high association between this bone and the weights that are associated with the mesh. So that's just how much influence that bone has over that part of the mesh. So with that done, if we go ahead and try to grab the hand, if you look, basically the hand moves around now with everything we have. And I'm going to put it way out here so I can see how decent of a job I did. And obviously, there's some things that you don't want, but it's not bad. The main thing I don't like is this huge spike right there. So I'm going to put it up like that, and I'm going to use Subtract to see if I just got rid of that spike. Yes, I did. Oops. Alright. Now, you might be saying, that's not a very natural animation, and you're right, that it behaves that way because we haven't set up any of our inverse kinematics yet. So that said, I'm not going to force you to sit here and watch me paint all of the rest of the components for our mesh, or for each bone and everything like that. I'm just going to skip to the end, and then I'm going to show you what each bone looks like. We'll only be animating this arm because we're having to do all of the skinning manually. This mesh is just like that with Blender. Blender just, it can't skin some meshes. RigIT actually does a very, very phenomenally good job skinning, but BVH files don't contain any skin information, so you can't get the skin information out of RigIT into Blender, unfortunately. But that's just life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and keep working on this mesh, and then I will just chop this section out of the video and come back to you when everything is finished, and I'll kind of click through and show you what things look like, and then we'll show you how to do inverse kinematics so that you can actually set up animation and use the animations that you already have stored in your animation library. Okay, so we'll see you guys. Well, for you it'll be less than a second. For me it'll be quite a bit longer. Okay, I'm back. So when I left, I was showing you how to add the weights for the hand bone. So if we select the gauntlet and go to weight paint, you'll see that for her left hand we now have weights, and if we grab the hand and move it, the mesh goes with it, the appropriate portion of the mesh. Now we also added weights for the upper part of the gauntlet for the lower arm, and we did the same thing for her body armor. That's really not reassuring. There we go. So now you can see the weights for her forearm, for the underwear body armor over here, and we did similar for the upper arm. Now if we go to the pauldron, let's click off and on again. There we go. We can see we put some weights on the pauldron. And let's see here. Oh, and the shoulder. So as the female body armor. There we go. They're harder to see. Let me take a cursor off. There you go. Now, exactly how far you put the weights, when you're doing it manually, exactly how far you put it, a lot of times is artistic. And even if you do it automatically, a lot of times, from an artistic perspective, you'll want to come back and clean it up a bit. But there we go. That's what we have. So now, as you know, if we grab a hold of one of the joints and move it, we do have all of its child nodes moved with it, but it's kind of this weird, not really animated movement. It's just kind of dragging around the scene. So to actually add what most people would consider real animations, you want to apply inverse kinematics. Now, if all you're doing, like if you're taking it from an animation library, you actually don't have to do anything. You're basically already good to go. Because all of your actual animations in terms of rotations and that sort of thing, with respect to your joints, are already there, and inverse kinematics isn't going to really do anything. But to see how the animation will actually work, we're going to go ahead and add some inverse kinematics, and it helps you when if you're planning an animation. If you don't have the animation known already, the inverse kinematics will help you actually define the various animation key points and whatnot. So, what we're going to do is we're going to start with the hand. We'll just right-click on it. Let's just go ahead. Let's click on the skeleton over here in the scene tree, and then go into pose mode. You want to be in pose mode. A couple others have this feature as well, but the main reason to be in pose mode is you get this little feature over here on the right. Now, we don't need to worry about anything else at this point, but there we go. So, this little feature, it's got the bone, and then it's got what looks like two links in a chain on it. So you want to click on that, and then you'll get this add constraint button. Left click on that, then find inverse kinematics, click on that, and if you see the default is just kind of pointing at your root. Well, that doesn't really help anything. If you grab it, it kind of just pulls the whole thing around. You don't really want that. So undo what I just did. Come on. There we go. Add constraint, inverse kinematics. Then what we're going to do is we're going to set the chain length. So the chain length is going to be 4, and it's going to be 4 because there's 1, 2, 3, 4 bones in our chain. So we're just going to right click. Oop, one more. There we go, 4. And we'll go ahead and set it for all of our bones in our arms. So we'll go to the forearm, add constraint, inverse kinematics. You know what, let's undo that real quick. And we're going to undo it because I want to show you don't need to do it. So we've got this animation, and then now if you click it, it'll drag, and you see that you can actually move the arm about now. Alright, so you see you started to get the ability to animate. Actually, you have the ability to animate. But I want to be able to click on the forearm and move it and have it move appropriately too. So we're just going to add inverse kinematics for all of the arm pieces. So we'll just go over here, add constraint, same way we did with hand, to 3 this time, and we'll do it for the upper arm. 1, 2, and you don't need to for the shoulder because there's nothing below the shoulder, but we'll go ahead and add it. We'll just put a 1. And now, it doesn't matter where we select, if we click on it, grab, you're gonna be able to move your mesh around. Now, so there you go. Now we can actually animate our mesh, and if you have an animation library, you don't even have to do the inverse kinematics. But if you don't have a mesh library, you can use the inverse kinematics to help pose your figure naturally in a scene and change the pose iteratively over time to develop an animation or new animation and that sort of thing. So that's it. well, let's see here. I get that's if all you want to know about is animation, that's basically it. Let me go over some just kind of words of wisdom, just that I found very useful when I was doing this, especially with a real pain mesh like this one. So if you're working with a lot of these guys like the pauldron and stuff, it can get confusing really quick. And if you notice in just now when I was clicking on different meshes or different bones, sometimes it didn't always immediately show the weights that I had applied. Well, one of the things that can happen is you think you have the upper arm highlighted or clicked on, and you think you're adding weights to it, but you actually are adding weights to the hand. So when you're adding weights, be very sure that you've actually selected the upper arm, and that might mean just clicking away and clicking back real quick. The other is that a lot of times with these graphics, you even have to like go inside them to make sure you have everything selected. Um, I know it seems really weird sometimes, but that's basically what you have to do sometimes, because it'll be hard to find pieces where if you pull the bone way out to the side, there's always that one little point that's trailing behind. You can't figure it out. If that happens to you, try going inside the bone or the mesh and try and look around that way and just play with it. See what other ways. As far as knowing scope, again, it's kind of an artistic thing, and it really depends on your system and everything that's running. My natural inclination, for example, is for the upper arm. I have influence really all the way down because my thought is that's pulling this material when you move the arm, but with the way that Blender does its animations, that's just what happens is when the arm rotates up, all of this will try to swing out with the arm, which isn't really what you want it to do. So there's not really elasticity in the model, so there's just things like that to keep in mind, and that's probably all the words of wisdom I can give you. And good luck, happy animations, and I hope you found me useful. Thanks.